Alaska.
Whoa, no touchy. No touchy. No touch.
Yo, it's been too long since I've just sat down and done a bunch of research for a video. You know, I've actually been kind of missing it. Things have been quite busy as of lately, and I haven't just had the time to plunge in and do some research. But now, since school's canceled, I've got the time, so I'll see you downstairs. Alright, so this may be kind of a little bit of a ridiculous topic, but it is a question that I hear again and again and again from different people. So I felt, you know, it's probably a good idea. Let's just make a video about it while we're doing somewhat of a series on Eve and the garden. And so the question that we're trying to tackle today is whether or not when Eve said, "You shall not even touch of the tree," was that a lie or not? But I've heard over years all these different theories behind it. Is it a sin? Is it not a sin? What's going on here? So we're just gonna break it down. Let's just quote the verses. In Genesis chapter 2, God gives the command to Adam, and in 2:16 he says, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of any of the trees in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for the day that you do, you will surely die." And then Eve quotes God in Genesis 3:3 and says, "But God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die." So just comparing the two, there are differences between them. There's all these theories circulating this little phrase. Some will say she added it. Some will say, well, she's lying to God. And some will say a lot more crazy things. Why don't we just start off by tackling a few theories and ideas behind this? Now, some will argue that Genesis was written far later than when it actually took place. Now, I disagree with the later date. I do believe that it was written earlier. They say that the story has gone through some transformations and it's gone through some exaggerations in the millennia since it actually happened. Well, no, I don't agree with that either, because both Paul and Peter tell us that the word of God is inspired by God. And so it being a textual exaggeration, I don't really see that being the case. And the other thing is, why would you add that as a textual exaggeration? Why would you only have it in chapter 3 but not in chapter 2? It doesn't make sense. So now there's this other guy who takes somewhat of a weird approach, I think. But he goes into the playing of the words, which is actually something more we see in English and not in the original language. But apart from that and some of the other weird stuff, he puts forth a theory that seems to be picked up quite often. And this is one of the two main interpretations of this passage. Let's just read a couple quotes here. Now, with regards to Eve adding the touching part, he says, "Apparently Eve found it difficult to be repeatedly commanded." I don't know where he gets the repeatedly part from, but continuing. "The burden of commandments weighs down on mankind." Eve also made a significant change in describing the punishment. According to God, transgression surely leads to the punishment of death. According to Eve, there is no room for doubt, lest you die. Maybe, but maybe not. So one need not be in such awesome fear of God's commandments. Then he goes on to ask the question, did Eve intend to disobey her creator? Probably not. And then he goes on to talk about how the conversation between Eve and the serpent and how that led to Eve's disobedience, but how she was deceived. But he hints at this idea that Eve needed to be repeatedly commanded. And this whole idea, this interpretation is what leads to me even having to do this video, because this is the other option. To put it simply into what I believe is that it was more just a precaution that they took. But this view, I don't know what it's called or if even it has a name, like our last Eve video on whether or not Eve had sex with Satan and the whole serpent seeds theory. Yeah, you should watch that when you're done this. But I got 3 commentaries here. This one doesn't mention anything about it. But this one, it's a commentary series that I really like. It's good, but in this case, I disagree with their interpretation. This goes into further expanding what this guy here said. So they say, she was aware of the prohibition, therefore, and fully understood its meaning. She understood the commandment is what they're basically saying. But she added, neither shall you touch it, and proved by this very exaggeration that it appeared to be too stringent even to her, and therefore that her love and her confidence in God was already beginning to waver. Here was the beginning of her fall. For doubt is the father of sin, and skepsis the mother of all transgression, and in this father and in this mother, all our present knowledge has common origin with sin. Quoting Ziegler there. From doubt, the tempter advances to a direct denial of the truth of the divine threat and to a malicious suspicion of the divine love. That was a mouthful, but to sum it up, the argument is that the command of God to not eat of one tree, well, it was too much. It was too strict of God to ask of Eve. And this view, they don't directly say it, but it hints at that God commanding them to not eat of the tree sort of restricted their freedom as humans. And in so doing, Eve began to doubt God. And so when the serpent came up to her, she adds, well, I couldn't even touch it, because she's kind of, a little bit mad at God about it. Now, maybe I'm presenting this in more of a silly way than they intend, but I find if we try and present something as silly, it sort of allows us to clear the air. To paraphrase another several articles and another several people and a bunch of the other research that I did on this, Eve may have seen God as bad or evil because touching of the fruit, it's just too restrictive. It gives God a bad image. One issue that I have with this is that it does seem to give God a bad image. Not the command itself, but Eve's perception and their interpretation seems to give the same perception that they're saying Eve has. Meaning, Eve sees God as bad, then also the theory sees that God is bad. Because if God is being too restrictive, if this command is too much for Eve to have, where she's got this doubt in God, then it almost seems like it's God's fault that they fell. And I know some will argue that and push towards that, generally not Christians, but I'm wondering if this theory rides a little bit too close to that line. I don't really agree with this at all. I can see how somebody would agree with it. I can see how somebody can argue for it. I just don't see this doubt being an ongoing progressive thing in Eve's life until she finally gives in. And when she gives in, Adam gives in as well. So wouldn't doubt have been an ongoing thing in his life as well? And the reason why I don't agree with that is because they daily communed with God. So wouldn't God have seen this doubt growing in them? Now, yes, these points that I just said, they are somewhat assumptive, but so is their whole argument. They're assuming that Eve had ongoing doubt, and I don't. I got Matthew Henry here. I love Matthew Henry. Recently gave away a commentary series of his. I use this guy's works in most of my papers as a reference. He's good. What he has to say about this theory. He takes a different approach, which is along the same lines as my approach. He says, it was an instance of her resolution that she adhered to the command and faithfully repeated it. As of unquestionable certainty, God has said, which is her saying, I am confident that he has said, you shall not eat of the fruit of this tree. And that which she adds, neither shall you touch it, seems to have been with a good intention, not as some think, being this side over here and this one here, tacitly to reflect upon the command as too strict, as in touch not, taste not, and handle not, but to make offense about it. It is forbidden in the highest degree, and the authority of the prohibition is sacred to us. Meaning, as what I said earlier, they're taking precautions. And this is my view on it. He says they're building a fence around it. Let's just use the example of dating. Any good church will say that you need to have boundaries when you're dating. Now, the Bible is clear that sex outside of marriage is sin. And so to avoid that sin, you set boundaries. Boundaries like not being alone together in a private space. Is a couple being alone in a private space declared sinful in the Bible? No, but it's quite easy to make the argument that it's a good boundary to keep. And that's what I argue is going on here, and that's what Matthew Henry is arguing is going on here. That Eve isn't adding to the text because she has doubts about how good God actually is. It's her saying this is the only command that we have been told not to do, so I don't even want to get close to it. And now there also is some debate and question as to where did Eve receive this command? Because when you read it in Genesis 2:16, it takes place before Eve was even created. And the pronoun you that God uses when he says you shall not eat of it is second person masculine singular, meaning it was only given to Adam. But when Eve says it, she says it plurally. In verse 2, she says, we may eat of the fruit. We being a plural pronoun. And in verse 3, when God says, you shall not eat of it, that you is then plural. Then the question gets raised, well, did God give that command to Eve? Or was it Adam passing along the command of God to Eve? And the conversation could have gone something like this. Hello, Eve, my new wife, who is by far the most beautiful woman on the planet, who I greatly admire, who God created to be a great helper and companion to me. But there's a couple rules that we need to establish that are given by God to us.
Oh yes, certainly, my dear husband. What are these rules? And is there anything to eat around here? I'm getting famished.
Well, now that you had mentioned it, that is the only rule that God has given us. We can eat of any tree in the garden except for one, which is called the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Oh, is that the only rule God has given us?
Yes, that is the only rule that God has given us. He said, you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. So, let's not eat of it. You know what? Let's not even touch it, just for good measure.
Oh, that sounds like a terrific idea. You're so wise. You must be the most wisest person on the face of the earth.
I don't get paid enough for this. And to be honest, all really Adam has to say is, we can't eat of the fruit. You know what? Let's not even touch it, because if we can't touch it, we can't eat of it. Makes sense, right? I don't believe that Adam and Eve had this ongoing doubt about God and his character and his goodness. And because of this command, they now have this image that God is not really that good. It doesn't make sense to me. They had one rule, and they had a massive garden. And so there was no need for them to eat of the fruit. And we're told in one of Paul's letters to Timothy that Eve was deceived, but Adam rebelled. And the sin of Genesis 3 is not a lie. The sin isn't even eating fruit. The sin is rebellion against God. God had one rule, and it was a very simple rule. And Adam chose to disobey God. He chose to rebel against God. And so did Eve lie to Satan? No. I wouldn't argue that for a minute. But there are some that do, so we kind of got to tackle the question. But let me know what you think. If you know of any other odd-seeming theories about the Bible, let me know in the comment below. I'll dive into it. It's great to do some more research again. And make sure that you subscribe to the channel, that you like this video. And you know what? Pass it along to a friend. Helps me out. And for the next little while, we're going to have a lot more videos coming out because I don't know when school is going to be back in session. So let's see, maybe doubling our normal weekly output. So make sure that you got the bell notifications on so that you don't miss any of these videos. But until next time, remember to know the word, do the word, and share the word. But as always, we do it in love.